Did you know that the primary source of income for the US government for almost 100 years was actually tariffs? I find this stat so fascinating because it really highlights how important tariffs and trade deals were in the shaping of US history. We're still feeling these effects today as Trump is embarking on a new trade war between the US, Canada, Mexico, China, and the EU. And so we're starting a three-part mini-series within the Y series where I'm going to cover first the US history on tariffs, two, how tariffs work from an economist perspective, and then three, why Trump is fixated on tariffs. So this is episode 11, Why the US Loves Tariffs. Let's dive in. To really understand the role of tariffs in US history, I referenced the book Clashing Over Commerce by Douglas Irwin. This is an 800-page, very in-depth book detailing all of US commerce, and so I highly recommend it if you're very enthusiastic about economics, but if not, don't worry, I will cover it in this video. The author splits American history in three parts. First is the Tariff Revenue Era, second, the Protectionist Era, and third is the Free Trade Era. So era number one is the Tariff Revenue Era. So, the 16th Amendment is what granted Congress the constitutional power to levy taxes on corporations and individuals, thus creating the income tax. This wasn't until 1913, so prior to that, the main way that Congress raised income was actually through tariffs and excise taxes. This is very important historical context when answering the question why the US loves tariffs so much, because from our earliest founding years, tariffs were the primary source of income for the US to fund all of its projects, such as the military and public infrastructure, such as roads, canals, and the early railroads. One of the biggest proponents of tariffs was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was the architect behind the National Bank, the US monetary system, and he was the first US Treasury Secretary. In his 1791 report on the subject of manufactures, he outlined a vision where he wanted to transition the US from an agrarian society to an industrial one. He wanted to use moderate tariffs and its revenue to back American industries. This is very important because at that time, there was a division in political thought between the US focusing more on agriculture versus industrialization. You guys may know very famously that Alexander Hamilton's political rival was Thomas Jefferson. So Hamilton was very much focused on the northern industrialization, and Jefferson focused heavily on the southern agricultural society. Now, keep this thought in mind as we move along history into the 1800s. So, the Civil War was in 1861, and prior to that, the events leading up to the Civil War, there were many, but one of them from a tariff perspective was that there was a divide between the interests of tariffs between the North and the South. Before we dive in any deeper, let's just do a quick recap on what tariffs are because I see a lot of misinformation about this. Tariffs are a tax that is levied on imported goods, and the importer of the goods pays the taxes to the government, okay? So I just want to make this really clear because right now in the political discourse, there are a lot of people that think that the country that they're imposing the tariffs on pays for the tariff. No, it is the domestic importer that pays for the tariff. So if you're a US company and you're importing, let's say, soybeans from a different country, you're gonna pay a 25% tax on the imported soybean to the US government. So it's not that the other country pays the 25% tax to the US government, it's the US company that pays that. And the logic behind it is that if you do that, it'll incentivize US companies to buy from US manufacturers and suppliers instead of from cheaper foreign exporters. So I just want to make that super clear, okay? So in the North and the South, the North was primarily focused on industrialization, and they benefit from these taxes because they are the exporters of goods. So they're the ones that are selling goods out, and they don't want foreign competition. Now, the South is focused on agriculture and they want lower tariffs because they want to import cheap inputs for their agricultural society. So, for example, Britain had a lot of cheap imports that the South was importing into the US, and they didn't want those tariffs on those imports because it would increase the cost of their production when it came to farming. And so we see this divide between the North and the South, and that adds to these political tensions. One of the major turning points in that political tension between the US and the South was the 1828 Tariff of Abominations. I laugh at this because I just love the language so much. Like, why don't we name our policies this ridiculously anymore? Like, Tariff of Abomination is so it's perfect. And so what that tariff did is that it raised imports to a tax for 60%, which infuriated the South. The South was so pissed that South Carolina threatened to secede from the US, and they started a nullification clause where they basically said the states have the right to nullify any federal law if it doesn't apply to them. And so this was a huge turning point in the events leading up to the Civil War, because we see that the clashing between commerce policy, such as tariffs, between the North and the South was being more and more exacerbated. And so Andrew Jackson, at the time, he was able to temporarily do a compromise in 1833, which cooled things down a little bit. And so South Carolina, they didn't secede, obviously, and they repealed the nullification clause. But this is really important because this sets the stage for the political battleground, which leads up to the Civil War and the next era, which is the Protectionist era, which leads into the second major era, the Protectionist Tariff Era from 1861 to 1933. The American Civil War began in 1861, and the North needed funds to continue the war, and so they raised tariffs significantly to raise revenue through the Morrill Tariff Act. President Abraham Lincoln, at the time, who led the Republican Party, backed this. And this is very important because, as we talked about, the divide between the North, which was pro-industrialization and manufacturing, and the South, which focused on agriculture, Abraham Lincoln kind of had to almost take a gamble because, right, you're a president and you're trying to win this war to stop the secession of the southern states, who are primarily focused on agriculture, and thus they wanted to continue the use of African American slaves. And he's trying to figure out, like, what is the best move at the time. And where I argue is that he gambled on the North. He gambled on the North generating more money and income for the US in the future. And so he backs this. And this is very important because after the Civil War, we see a boom in US manufacturing, particularly in steel. Now we enter the Gilded Age, where we see a boom in American manufacturing and industrialists such as Carnegie and Rockefeller, where industries such as steel, manufacturing, and textiles and railroads, they really started to increase and ramp up during this time. And so I argue that this is very important because it still impacts today's differences when we look at the economies in America. I say this all the time, but it feels like America is a bunch of smaller countries put together, right? Like the Midwest and South are very different from the East or West Coast, right? And the North and the South. And so if you ever wondered why we see these divisions today, particularly in politics, well, it all kind of stems from this Civil War era where the president had to basically choose between what industries would benefit the most in the post-Reconstruction era, and the gamble was basically put on the northern manufacturers, and that paid off because during this time we see American manufacturing increase and American agricultural economy starts to decrease. And so we enter this protectionist tariff era because the American government really wanted to back these industries. And now we see this divide further exacerbated. So in the Midwest and the South, the farmers didn't want the tariffs because farming tools and imports became much costlier. But for the North, they were able to benefit greatly from this because they had less foreign competition. And so we enter kind of this free trade versus protectionist debate because you have the Midwest and South that wants more free trade so that they can buy cheaper imports from other countries. And then you have the protectionists, which are mostly the northern industrialists. And that leads into the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. This was a major tariff we have to study because it was one of the greatest economic policy disasters of American history, okay? So you have the Great Depression, and Congress tries to raise a bunch of tariffs to try to boost American economy, right? So previously, these tariffs have always worked, right? They worked when increasing revenue and they worked when protecting American manufacturers. But something happened during the Great Depression, right? In between World War I and World War II, where we see a totally different effect of tariffs now. The Smoot-Hawley tariff completely decimated global free trade, and it actually exacerbated the global economic crisis. And so many economists looking back can all almost unanimously agree that this tariff act was one of the worst acts by Congress that could have been done during this time, and it really hurt the American consumer. The American consumer was fighting these insanely high prices, and they're already like they're unemployed, they don't have money, they're depressed, right, economically. And this is really important because now we see world trade collapsed by 66% during this time, which is huge. And so when you're thinking of world trade and today's political discourse around the trade war, keep this in mind because we see that there were examples where tariffs did work and times when tariffs didn't work. And it's all because of these underlying, more complex global factors that we're going to analyze in the next videos. Finally, we enter the latest era, the free trade era from 1934 to present, although now you could argue that we're kind of evolving beyond that. And so here we see that tariffs were used as a political tool to negotiate against other countries rather than to really focus on revenue generation or protectionism of American manufacturers. And so during this time in 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt enacted the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, where he was able to lower tariffs. And why this act was so important is because for the first time, it allowed the president to negotiate trade deals without Congress. Okay, this is really critical, guys, because prior to this act, all of the tariffs that were enacted were proactively pushed by Congress. But now we see a shift in the responsibility of who is going to propose and enact tariffs from the Congress to the presidential branch. And so this will give you a little bit more context when I explain in the next video why Trump is so fixated on tariffs, because this is how the president is able to use tariffs now as a means of diplomacy, and it ties more into their personal agenda when they're trying to be like a popular president. And so just keep that in mind, okay? We're going to dive deeper into that soon. And so post World War II, we see a new trade system which focuses on free trade. So the US creates the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and then that later becomes the World Trade Organization, where it promotes global free trade. So less tariffs and just free trade between all countries. And the major free trade agreements during this time was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1994, and this opened up free trade between US, Canada, and Mexico. So if you're wondering why Trump is going after Canada and Mexico so heavily in the news, think about this trade agreement, okay? And then in 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization, and from here is an inflection point, okay? This is very important. From here, we see a decline in US manufacturing and an exponential increase in Chinese manufacturing. And it's because of this new free trade environment. And why this is so important is because it's going to help you understand why Trump is so fixated on China. And I'm going to explain in the upcoming videos why China and the US are coming to kind of this economic clash of two superpowers and what is really happening behind the scenes from an economics perspective. And so now we go into 2018 and 2020, which was the first presidential term for President Trump, and he basically kind of ended this free trade system by starting a new trade war. So this is when he started enacting a bunch of tariffs, particularly in renewable energy, like solar panels. I think he did dishwashers, and he just starts putting tariffs on everything, okay? And the Biden administration pretty much continued those tariffs and added a few more. And then now we're in the present day where there is a new trade war happening where Trump is enacting 25% tariffs on all goods in Canada and Mexico. And then he's fighting or negotiating with the EU and China as well. And so during this time, we're going to see retaliatory tariffs, where these are tariffs that the other country will impose back at us. And so a trade war begins. And so I hope this kind of gives you sort of a historical background on how tariffs shaped the US history. The main key takeaways that we need to understand is that tariffs were always a part of how the US was able to negotiate trade deals and also to raise revenue. The revenue generation has significantly decreased, so now the primary source of income for the US government is income taxes and Social Security and Medicare taxes. But this is still really important because a lot of the principles that Alexander Hamilton talked about on why he wants to use tariffs, Trump talks about those same talking points as well. The idea that it's going to bolster American manufacturing jobs, that the US government needs to have a more critical role, a proactive role in making sure that American industries are protected from foreign competition, and to also punish other countries for any unfair trade practices. I'm going to cover more of these in depth in the upcoming video as well. So I hope this was helpful. This was kind of like a, just an easy intro history lesson. And in the next video, we're going to cover now from an economics perspective how tariffs work, why they don't work, and why 87% of economists agree that tariffs are ineffective in today's modern economy. I hope that was helpful. I'll see you in the next video.